Montgomery, you will apologize to Patton immediately, or get out. Your insubordination is unacceptable.
January 7th, 1945. The Battle of the Bulge has just ended. Hitler's last desperate gamble in the West has been crushed. But inside Allied headquarters, a new war has erupted. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery has just given a press conference where he claimed, with breathtaking arrogance, that he personally saved the Americans from disaster in the Ardennes. The reaction is volcanic. George Patton is ready to challenge Montgomery to a duel. Omar Bradley threatens to resign. Dwight Eisenhower is so furious that he drafts his own resignation letter. In London, Winston Churchill receives an urgent message. The Allied coalition is 24 hours away from complete collapse. Churchill picks up his secure telephone and delivers an ultimatum to his top field marshal. 3 words that will echo through history: shut up or get out. The press conference took place at Montgomery's headquarters in Zonhoven, Belgium, on January 7, 1945. The Battle of the Bulge had officially ended just days earlier. American forces had suffered enormous casualties, over 19,000 killed, but they had held. Hitler's gamble to split the Allied armies had failed. It should have been a moment of unity. Instead, Bernard Montgomery turned it into his personal victory parade. Montgomery entered the briefing room with his characteristic swagger, his beret positioned at a jaunty. What the assembled press corps got was a masterclass in narcissism and diplomatic sabotage. Montgomery began by painting a picture of American incompetence. He described how the German offensive had caught the Americans completely by surprise, how their lines had collapsed, how panic had threatened to spread through the entire American First Army. Then, with barely concealed satisfaction, Montgomery described his own role. He claimed that Eisenhower had begged him to take command of American forces north of the German Bulge. He portrayed himself as the calm, professional British commander who had ridden to the rescue of his disorganized American allies. He used phrases like tidying up the battlefield and getting the show back on the rails, as if the Americans were school children who needed a stern British headmaster to restore order. But it was what Montgomery said about the future that truly ignited the firestorm. He declared that the battle proved the necessity of a single ground commander for all Allied forces, and he made it clear that he believed himself to be the only man qualified for that role. He dismissed American strategic thinking as pedestrian. He suggested that British military experience was superior. He painted a picture where British commanders were the brains and American soldiers were merely the muscle. The American journalists sat in stunned silence. They had covered the Battle of the Bulge from the ground. They had seen American soldiers fighting with desperate courage. They had watched the 101st Airborne hold Bastogne against overwhelming odds. They had witnessed Patton's Third Army execute one of the most brilliant military maneuvers of the war, pivoting 90 degrees north in winter and smashing into the German flank. And now they were listening to a British field marshal claim credit for American blood. One reporter asked Montgomery directly about Patton's role in relieving Bastogne. Montgomery's response was dismissive to the point of insult. He acknowledged that Patton had moved quickly, but suggested it was reckless and could have ended in disaster if not for Montgomery's coordination. He implied that Patton was a cowboy, brave perhaps, but lacking strategic sophistication. By the time the 45-minute press conference ended, Montgomery believed he had cemented his reputation as the savior of the Ardennes. What he had actually done was light a fuse that led directly to the most serious crisis in Allied unity of the entire war. Within hours, transcripts were being read in Allied headquarters across Europe. Reaction, particularly among American commanders, was thermonuclear. George Patton read the transcript in his headquarters in Luxembourg. His face turned purple with rage. He immediately dictated a message to Eisenhower. The language was so profane, it had to be, but the core message was clear. Montgomery's statements were not just insulting. They were lies. Patton's Third Army had executed the most difficult military maneuver of the campaign, had relieved Bastogne, had pushed the Germans back. And Montgomery, whose forces barely engaged until the battle was nearly over, was claiming credit. Omar Bradley's reaction was even more significant. Bradley was not hot-headed like Patton. He was calm, methodical, diplomatic, but Montgomery's press conference pushed him past his breaking point. Bradley sent a formal message stating that if Montgomery was given overall ground command, he would request relief and return to the United States. He could not serve under a man who had such contempt for American capabilities. The crisis reached its peak within 24 hours. At Chef headquarters, the atmosphere was toxic. American officers walked the corridors with barely suppressed fury. British liaison officers tried to make themselves in. And in Eisenhower's office, a procession of American generals delivered the same message. Something had to be done about Montgomery. Patton arrived on January 8th, still seething. He didn't wait for pleasantries. He told Eisenhower bluntly that Montgomery's statements were a strategic threat to Allied unity. If Montgomery was allowed to get away with this grandstanding, it would embolden him further and demoralize American soldiers who had bled in the Ardennes. But Patton went further. He told Eisenhower that if he didn't take decisive action, American commanders would lose faith in Eisenhower's leadership. Patton made it personal. He said he had turned down opportunities to return home because he believed in Eisenhower and the mission, but he could not serve in an army where a pompous British field marshal claimed credit for American victories. Then Patton delivered his ultimatum, fire Montgomery, or I'm going home. Bradley's position was more measured but equally firm. He simply laid out the facts. American forces had borne the brunt of the offensive. American soldiers had held at Bastogne and St. Vite. Patton's relief of Bastogne was one of the most impressive feats of military logistics in modern warfare. And Montgomery, whose forces played a secondary role, was claiming primary credit. Bradley told Eisenhower that if Montgomery was rewarded with overall ground command, it would send a message that merit didn't matter, that political manipulation trumped battlefield performance. He would rather resign than participate in what he saw as a betrayal of American soldiers. The situation exploded when the American press published stories about Montgomery's press conference. The reaction in the United States was volcanic. Newspapers questioned why American soldiers were dying while British commanders took credit. Congressional leaders made statements about protecting American prestige. Public opinion, solidly behind the Allied cause, began to waver. Eisenhower faced an impossible choice: fire Montgomery and create a crisis with Britain, or do nothing and lose the confidence of his American commanders and possibly his own position. The American press and Congress would demand accountability. Allied unity would collapse from within. In this moment of maximum crisis, Eisenhower made his decision. He drafted a formal letter to the combined chiefs of staff, laying out the situation and offering his resignation, forcing them to choose between him and Montgomery. Either Montgomery would be relieved or Eisenhower would step down. The letter was never sent. Before Eisenhower could transmit it, a secure communication arrived from London. Winston Churchill had been briefed on the crisis, and Churchill understood immediately that Montgomery had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The message to Eisenhower was simple: hold position, take no irreversible action, and wait 24 hours. Churchill would handle Montgomery. In the war rooms beneath Whitehall, Winston Churchill sat in cigar smoke and contemplated a problem that threatened to destroy everything he had worked for. The Allied coalition was on the verge of collapse, and the cause was one of his own field marshals, a man whose tactical competence Churchill respected, but whose political judgment he had always questioned. Churchill had read the transcripts and been briefed on the American reaction. He understood this was not merely a personality conflict. This was a strategic crisis that could alter the course of the war. If American commanders lost confidence and Britain refused to remove Montgomery, the alliance could fracture. And if the alliance fractured, the war might drag on for years. But
Churchill's concern went deeper. He understood the fundamental reality of the Anglo-American relationship. Britain was the junior partner. American industrial might, manpower, and resources were the foundation of Allied victory. Any British leader who forgot this truth, who allowed British pride to damage the alliance, was a liability. Churchill had always had a complex relationship with Montgomery. He admired his victories in North Africa and valued his ability to inspire British troops. But he had also seen the vanity, the political maneuvering, the tendency to claim credit and deflect blame. Churchill had tolerated these flaws because Montgomery won battles, but now Montgomery's ego had become a strategic threat. Churchill called in his advisors, including Field Marshal Alan Brooke, Montgomery's. Brooke tried to defend his protege, arguing that the American reaction was overblown, but Churchill cut him off. This was not about tactical performance, this was about political
survival. If Britain lost American trust, Britain would lose the war and the peace that followed. Churchill then drafted a personal message directly to Montgomery. The language was brutal. Churchill told Montgomery that his press conference had created a crisis threatening the war effort. American commanders were demanding his removal, and Eisenhower had offered to resign. Then Churchill delivered his ultimatum. Montgomery would immediately issue a public statement praising American performance and acknowledging their primary role, or Churchill would personally recommend to the king that Montgomery be relieved of command. The message was even more pointed in private sections. Churchill reminded Montgomery that he served at the pleasure of His Majesty's government, that no British field marshal was irreplaceable. The choice was simple: shut up or get out. Churchill also outlined exactly what Montgomery needed. He would request a meeting with Eisenhower and senior American commanders. He would explicitly acknowledge the primary American role in defeating the offensive. He would praise Patton's relief of Bastogne and Bradley's steadiness. He would make clear his role had been supportive, not decisive. And he would do all of this without qualification or subtle attempts to preserve his own narrative. Montgomery's initial response tried to argue. He suggested his statements had been accurate, that American sensitivity was understandable but misplaced. Churchill's response was immediate and devastating. You will comply with my instructions, or you will be relieved. There is no third option. Montgomery, faced with reality, capitulated, but Churchill was not satisfied with grudging compliance. The apology needed to be genuine, public, and humiliating enough to satisfy American honor. Montgomery was not merely correcting a misunderstanding. He was being forced to eat crow, to publicly acknowledge he had been wrong, and to elevate American commanders above
himself. It was the price of keeping his command. The meeting took place on January 11th at Eisenhower's headquarters in Versailles. The atmosphere was glacial. Eisenhower sat behind his desk, expressionless. Omar Bradley sat to his right, jaw set hard. George Patton, normally unable to sit still, was perfectly motionless, eyes fixed on the door. And when Bernard Montgomery entered, accompanied only by a single aide, the temperature dropped further. Montgomery looked diminished. The swagger was gone. The jaunty beret was positioned normally. His face showed uncertainty, even fear. He knew why he was. Churchill's ultimatum had been clear. This was not a negotiation. This was public penance, and his entire career depended on performing it convincingly. Eisenhower did not rise to greet Montgomery. He simply gestured to a chair and waited. The silence stretched out, uncomfortable and deliberate. Montgomery began by saying he had requested this meeting to clarify certain
statements. Eisenhower interrupted immediately. His voice was cold, but controlled. He told Montgomery this was not about clarification. This was about correction. Montgomery had made statements that were factually inaccurate and politically damaging, and he was here to set the record straight. Montgomery said haltingly that his press conference had not adequately acknowledged the primary American role. He admitted his characterization had been incomplete. But even now, facing the end of his career, Montgomery could not quite bring himself to full contrition. He began to explain his tactical reasoning to justify his decision. Patton exploded. He stood up and told Montgomery that tactical soundness was not the issue. The issue was that Montgomery had lied, had stolen credit for American blood, and had insulted every soldier who fought in the Ardennes. Patton cataloged Montgomery's failures: his slowness in Market Garden, his caution at Caen, his constant demands for resources while criticizing American aggressiveness. Then Patton delivered the core accusation. Montgomery was a political general who cared more about his reputation than winning the war. Eisenhower raised a hand, silencing Patton but did not contradict him. Instead, he told Montgomery that his press conference had nearly destroyed the Allied coalition, that American commanders had lost confidence, and that only Churchill's personal intervention had saved his career. Montgomery's future depended entirely on his ability to repair the damage, and that repair would begin now. Montgomery tried to preserve some dignity, suggesting a written statement. Eisenhower shook his head. Montgomery would make a public speech, give another press conference, and explicitly state that American forces had borne the primary burden, that American commanders made the key decisions, and that British forces played a supporting role. He would praise Patton by name. He would acknowledge Bradley's leadership without
qualification. Montgomery's face went white. To make such statements publicly demolish his carefully constructed narrative. It would be professional humiliation on a scale few commanders had ever endured. But Montgomery looked around the room, saw the implacable faces, and understood he had no choice. He nodded, barely perceptibly, and agreed. The meeting ended without hand. Montgomery left, shoulders slumped, confidence shattered. Behind him, Patton spoke quietly, but with anger still edging his voice. He said Montgomery had gotten off, that he should have been relieved. But Eisenhower shook his head. Montgomery's humiliation was punishment enough, and it sent a message. American commanders would not be disrespected, American sacrifices would not be diminished, and political maneuvering would not substitute for battlefield performance. 3 days later, Montgomery gave his second press conference. His statement was everything Eisenhower had demanded. He praised American forces lavishly, acknowledged they had borne the primary burden, singled out Patton and Bradley for commendation, and described his own role as supportive and secondary. And he did it all in a tone that made clear every word was being dragged out of him. It was forced contrition disguised as gracious acknowledgement. And for Montgomery, it was the beginning of his decline from the pinnacle of Allied command. The Montgomery crisis of January 1945 marked a fundamental shift in Allied command, though its full significance would only become clear in the months that followed. Montgomery retreated into sullen compliance, executing orders competently, but without the aggressive self-promotion that had characterized his earlier career. He had learned that in coalition war, political skills mattered as much as tactical brilliance. For Eisenhower, the crisis reinforced his authority in a way no battlefield victory could have. By forcing Montgomery to back down, by defending American commanders even against a British field marshal, Eisenhower earned absolute loyalty from his subordinate. American generals who had sometimes chafed under his diplomatic caution now saw that when it mattered most, Eisenhower would fight for them. But it was George Patton who benefited most from Montgomery's humiliation. In the weeks following, Patton's Third Army led the Allied advance into Germany with speed and aggression that vindicated every controversial decision Eisenhower had made in keeping him in. Patton's relief of Bastogne, which Montgomery had tried to minimize, was now universally recognized as one of the war's defining moments. His 90-degree pivot became a case study in military execution. And his personality, which had sometimes seemed a liability, now appeared as exactly what the moment demanded: uncompromising, aggressive, and utterly confident. Churchill's role in resolving the crisis cemented his reputation as a master strategist who understood that
wars are won through alliances, not just battles. His brutal treatment of Montgomery shocked many in the British establishment, but Churchill had recognized that Britain's future depended on maintaining American trust, and that no British commander's ego was worth jeopardizing that relationship. In his private papers, Churchill reflected extensively on the crisis. He wrote that Montgomery had committed the cardinal sin of confusing personal glory with national interest. Britain was fighting for survival, and survival depended on American support, not just during the war, but in the peace that followed. Montgomery's press conference had threatened that support for one man's vanity. The field marshal had been a pawn sacrificed to protect the king. Churchill also wrote his assessment of Patton. The prime minister had initially been skeptical of the American general, but Patton's performance in the Ardennes had changed his mind. The relief of Bastogne was one of those rare moments when
tactical brilliance and psychological warfare combined perfectly. Patton had not just moved his army quickly, he had restored American confidence at a critical moment. He had proven that American commanders could match or exceed their British counterparts. The long-term consequences extended far beyond the immediate participants. The command structure of the final drive into Germany reflected the new reality. Montgomery's 21st Army Group continued operating in the north, but the primary thrust belonged to American command. Patton's Third Army raced across southern Germany. Bradley's 12th Army Group became the dominant force, and Eisenhower directed operations with a decisiveness that had sometimes been lacking in earlier campaigns. Montgomery himself never fully recovered from the heat. He continued to command effectively, and his final operations in Germany were professionally executed. But his dreams of overall ground command died in that meeting at Versailles. He would spend the rest of his life trying to rehabilitate his reputation, writing memoirs that emphasized his contributions and minimized his mistakes. But historians rendered a harsh verdict. Montgomery had been a competent, sometimes brilliant tactician, but he had been a poor coalition partner, a worse politician, and a man whose ego had nearly cost the Allies their unity. The ultimate irony was that Montgomery's attempt to claim credit for the bulge had the opposite effect. Instead of elevating his reputation, it ensured that Patton's role would be remembered as the decisive intervention. Generations of historians would study Patton's 90-degree pivot, his logistics, his speed, his psychological impact. Montgomery's defensive operations were largely forgotten, overshadowed by the drama of his press conference and forced apology. For the British military establishment, the crisis became a cautionary tale about the realities of coalition warfare in an age of American dominance.
The lesson was clear. Britain could no longer dictate terms to its allies. The days when British generals automatically assumed senior command were over. The future belonged to those who could work within American-led coalitions. who could balance national pride with strategic necessity. And for the American military, the crisis validated a truth that would shape the rest of the 20th century, that American forces, commanders, and methods had come of age. The generation that had grown up in the shadow of European military prestige had proven beyond question that it could match the best the old world had to offer. Patton, Bradley, and Eisenhower had faced down one of Britain's most decorated commanders and forced him to acknowledge American superiority. It was a moment of national coming of age, and its echoes would resound through every subsequent conflict America would fight.